Men bloviate, God speaks. I love that word bloviating. It's such a onomatopoeia, you know. It very much sounds like what it is. Men bloviate. They say many things, many words, but God speaks. And when he speaks, we ought to listen to him because it's the only words that matter in the end. So once again, we come humbly into the speech that God gives to Job and his friends, mostly to Job, which is found in Job chapters 38 to 41. And we started into this speech a couple of weeks ago with an introduction, and then last week we began looking at the speech as God calls Job to come before him. But I would put before you again the three considerations. Keep in mind as we are working our way through this speech. Don't let these things get too far away from you as you're reading and thinking about this passage. Number one, there is an answer to Job's suffering in this passage. It's not what we would think it is, because God doesn't come and give a reason. We'll talk more about that in a second, but he does give an answer, and the answer is who he is. All right, so it's about who he is. We also must consider the fact that sometimes when God comes in a storm, as he does here in a great whirlwind, that it's designed to get our attention. Sometimes it's designed to show us even the greatness of God, as we have a tendency to forget the greatness of God. And then thirdly, this speech is, as I said, the answer to the question, why did God call a heavenly council and gather the angels with him? More specifically, why did he call Satan to come and stand before him? In other words, why is this book in our Bible? And this is what we're discovering. So I pointed out, you remember, that this speech of God across chapters 38 to 41 actually has two halves. The first half of this is chapters 38 and 39. And God is going to ask Job a series of rhetorical questions about what he has created and whether Job was involved in the design of each of those elements. Now, that's by implication. Okay, he doesn't come right out and say that, although he does a few places along the way very closely intimate that. But by implication, he's asking Job, were you there? Did you help? Did I get your counsel in all of this? In other words, what we see in the first half of this speech is God's sovereignty over the creation, over what he created, and no one, therefore, dares question his power or his morality. In other words, why he has done what he has done. In the second half of the speech, then, God will rebuke Job for elevating himself to a position of God in lowercase g, by asking another set of rhetorical questions regarding man's power and position in relationship to what has been created. So the second half naturally follows from the first in that sense. In this case, it's the sovereignty of God over man. First half, sovereignty of God over creation. Second half, sovereignty of God over man, meaning that no one dares to question his authority or intentions in all of this. So what we've seen so far in our short examination of verses 1 to 7 could basically be summed up like this. God asking this question, where were you, O Job, when I, the Creator, established the foundations of the world, when I created the building blocks of the universe, when the angelic audience that I had formed to observe shouted for joy at the order and the beauty and the purpose of it all? Where were you? Which leads us back then into the speech. And what I'm about to say is a lie. We are not going to go through this speech verse by verse. I said that a couple of weeks ago, and then I said it again last week, and I've discovered as I sit in my office and study this, it's like, all right, we're going to have to go through it verse by verse. Well, we're not really going to go through it verse by verse, as you will see, so it's not completely a lie. Because I want you to remember that the intention, God's intention in this speech, is to rapid fire a series of questions at Job. And the goal is to keep him off balance in his puny nature as a creature, as one from the very earth itself. The idea is God's going to be using sort of a shotgun approach to just blast at Job question after question after question after question, not giving him a moment to stop and think about it and come up with an answer. He just rapid fire, if you will, into Job to keep him off nature. Meaning that the purpose of the speech itself is not to describe God's work in detail, but to point out that no one except God can possibly understand how it was formed and what it entails. Okay? This is the irony of this, you see. When we think that we should go through this speech and examine every little detail of it and start asking scientific questions about, okay, how did this happen? How did this happen? It misses the point of the speech. Job didn't get that opportunity. Job didn't get a chance to stop and say, okay, wait, God, wait. When you said that you spoke and, the building blocks of the world were formed, let's talk about how that happened a little bit so I can get an understanding. That was never the intention. God's intention was to say, I built it and you weren't there. It doesn't matter how it was built, okay? Our inability to truly know and understand the details is exactly the point that God is making before Job. So our clumsy nature is to, want to stop and examine everything in detail, but we need to stop instead. We need to simply read and consider this speech. So that's what we're going to be doing starting now. We're going to read and consider very briefly each section of this speech. We'll look at some of the first half this week, and then I'll make an observation about its relevance to us when we get to the end. In other words, I'm going to take God's approach. Ready? All right. Now, let me once again draw an observation to your attention that you need to consider as we've entered this book. I made this last week, but I want to say it again. In many ways, God's speech here in the first half mirrors the creation account of Genesis 1. The mirror is stark. He starts with the foundations of the earth, right? We saw this in verses 4 to 7, and you can compare that almost identically to Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 10. You have the foundations with their measurements. You have the bases, its cornerstone. We talked about all this last week. God forming the foundations of the universe itself. Similar to the description in Genesis 1 of the establishment of light, day and night, the expanse, the formation of a unique planet called Earth as compared to the sea and so forth. In other words, there's a very real parallel in what God says here to what we see in the very earliest verses of Genesis chapter 1. But then God moves away from that to what I refer to as the ecosystems of the earth. All of chapter 38, verses 8 to 37. I have 38. 38, yes, 38. All of those verses are referring to the ecosystems of the earth. So we're going to be seeing things like the sea along with the deep, the morning along with light and darkness, the snow, hail, rain along with the clouds and floods, and the stars. You might call it the ecosystems of the earth, everything that happens on the face of the earth. And it's similar to the description that you see in Genesis 1 of the creation of dry land, vegetation, the lights in the expanse, along with the sun and the moon. There's an interesting parallel there, isn't there? And then the next part of the speech, starting in chapter 38, verse 39, is the animal kingdom. All right, so we'll start looking at the pictures of the lion and the goats and so on upon the earth, so it moves into the animal kingdom. And of course, you remember that parallels exactly with the final days of creation in the Genesis 1 account. And then the speech in the second half of the speech will move into the place of man, who becomes then the final created thing and becomes obviously the most important. So this will be the order we're going to take through this speech. We're going to go chronologically through the speech. We're going to group together sections of similar nature in the order that they appear in the book of Genesis. Now, that won't be hard. It won't be difficult. You'll see the parallels very easily. All right? So as I said, we're going to move through each section of the speech, and we'll read a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about it, and we'll read a little more, and we'll see how it fits into the Genesis account chronologically. All right, so chapter 38, let's go to verse 8. So here's God speaking again to Job. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Now jump down to verse 16. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all of this. This past year when I traveled to Kenya, I had the opportunity to stand at the edge of the Indian Ocean on the eastern shore of Kenya in Mombasa. And it had been the third major ocean that I had laid eyes upon, or better, actually touched my toe into. I had seen the Pacific with my own eyes. I had seen the Atlantic with my own eyes. Now I had seen the third of the major oceans of the earth, the Indian Ocean. And when you stand there at the edge of the ocean, you realize the awesome nature of the ocean, its massiveness. It's truly awe-inspiring from a human perspective. You stand there at the coast of Kenya and you look out in the direction that it's going, which is slightly south and east, and you realize that it's 5,000 miles of nothing but water between there and the western shore of Australia. 5,000 miles. In other words, a plane trip from New York to Los Angeles and back again. Twice the distance across this continent, just water. Years ago, I flew from Los Angeles, California to Sydney, Australia, 15 hours by aircraft, nonstop, 7,500 miles over nothing but water. Nothing but water below you. Water covers approximately 71% of the surface area of the earth. Water covers approximately 71% of the earth, and scientists estimate that the oceans of the earth contain 321 million cubic miles of water. Now try to get your mind around that idea, okay? Now, first of all, just imagine a cubic mile. Okay, you know how big a cubic mile is, right? A mile this way, a mile this way, and a mile this way. Okay, so imagine a cube that's a mile square, or a mile cube, right? Okay, there you have it. You got that in your mind? Can you imagine such a place? It's kind of hard, isn't it? I mean, get in your car and drive a mile, right? And then turn and drive a mile that way, and then climb an object that's a mile high. Okay, that's the size. The oceans of the earth contain 321 million of those. Not just one, 321 million cubic miles. The sheer volume of the oceans, the seas of the earth is so great that we as tiny little land dwellers cannot fathom its true size. We cannot really consider the massiveness of the sea all around us. We cannot capture the immensity of the oceans from our perspective. You stand at the seashore and you look out. You stand at the Gulf and realize it's 800 miles to the Yucatan Peninsula. Am I right? That's right. It's the Yucatan Peninsula, right? 800 miles south. And nothing but water between here and there. God says, "O Job, can you explain how the seas were formed? Can you grasp their power?" You see, what God is going to do here, and you will find this to be true all the way through the rest of this speech, that God is going to, in each of these little sections, each of these questions, He's going to paint a picture. And He's going to paint a picture in each of the element of something of immense power. Something of immense power. Power is going to be the key idea in all of what God is going to be speaking here. He's going to draw a contrast in each series of questions between his power as God and our power as humans. That's what he's doing. He's drawing a contrast between the two things. In other words, he's saying, you, O man, are unable to receive the answers you demand from me, the Creator, because you possess no power. You are powerless. You can't move anything. You cannot change the boundaries of the sea. How much time and money do they spend in Alabama trying to rebuild the beach every time a storm comes in? And then they just turn around and have to do it again. And they haven't really moved the beach 1 inch, have they? We have no power over these things. Compared to me, the Almighty, you are nothing. And any power you do possess is only because I have given it to you. Now, it is true that the Genesis account does tell us that man was given dominion over the seas and everything in them. You can read that in Genesis 1:28. The man was given, that God gave to Adam dominion over the seas and everything in them. But it's important to remember that this authority, this dominion that God gave to Adam, was a derived power. It wasn't an internal power native to Adam. It was something given to him by God. And his finitudes of being a creature limited what he could do with that dominion. And then, of course, all of it frustrated by the fall. The ability to take dominion over everything destroyed in any limited sense by man falling into sin. You see, my friends, it's only in redemption, it's only in the work of the one who was born in Bethlehem that such dominion will truly come. It's only in redemption that such dominion will truly come. And any such dominion that we will have will still be as creatures, granted the power God delegates to us. Now, yes, I do believe that once the kingdom is established and Christ has taken dominion over all things himself, he will grant to us the ability to once again take dominion over the created order, but we will still be creatures. It will still be a derived authority. It's only in redemption also that we are able to truly grasp the immensity of everything we experience in this created world. It's only through the lens of redemption that we're actually able to comprehend the massiveness of what is taking place around us. A thought I want to stick in your head and I will come back to in a moment. Which leads us then to chapter 38, verse 12. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? Jump down to verse 19. Where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness, that you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its homes? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. End quote. Now, I will observe the following in this pericope. The word morning in verse 12 and the words light and darkness in verse 19 are paralleled and maybe references to one of two things. All right? There's two possibilities here of what we're talking about. First, we might be talking here about the distinction between morning and evening as the rotation of the earth produces literal days. Okay, so as the earth spins around its axis in relation to the sun, morning comes and then night comes and morning comes and night comes. So it's possible that God is simply referring here to the actual rotation of the earth that produces morning and evening. The reference to the dawn in verse 12 seems to reference a physical phenomenon. Something happens. Morning comes, and then you have midday, and then you have dusk, and then you have darkness, and then it all starts all over again, and we continue. So it could be that God is referring here to the idea of days and nights, and him saying, can you change that? Or there's another possibility here. And that is the possibility that God is actually making a distinction not between literal mornings and evenings, but the distinction between good and evil, which is metaphorically pictured throughout Scripture as the difference between light and darkness. The reference to the wicked in verses 13 and 15 being shaken out of the darkness suggests the idea of light bringing out into the open the deeds of the wicked, which are done under cover of darkness, hiding, right? So there's a possibility that God is speaking here of the physical realities of morning and night, day and night, or the metaphorical realities of darkness and good and evil, light and darkness. In my opinion, it's both. I know. Chicken, yeah. It's both. Because God asked this question. Oh, Job, did you command, now notice the word command, did you command light from darkness? Can you even grasp the difference between the two? Especially when the times in your life seem to be as both? You ever feel like you have times of both goodness, light, and badness, darkness at the same time? It's almost as though in part of your life things are going well, in the other part of your life it all stinks. It's sort of like the dawn. It's not light, and yet it's not dark. It's somewhere in between that. Can you, O Job, command the difference when you can't even understand the times in your life that seems to be as both? Like even now, as you sit on a hill and scrape yourself with a piece of pottery, you're still alive. I did not take your life. You're still alive. You still have some things to be grateful for, even in the midst of your suffering, right? So I'm wondering if God is asking him, yeah, I understand that you can't change night from day, but you can't even really understand the difference between good and evil, can you? You think you can, but you can't. Now, I will again have you notice the intentional sarcasm of God. At the end of this that I read, verse 21, he says, you know, Job, because you were born then and the number of your days is great. Now, that's intentional sarcasm. Somebody asked me last week, can God be sarcastic? I have Exhibit A here to say, yep. I would also argue that because we can be sarcastic, God must be sarcastic because we bear his image, and therefore, if we are capable, then he must be, right? Okay. In other words, Job, you stand here and demand answers related to the issues of good and evil, yet you were not around when I, the Creator, established such things in this world. You provided no input to them. And I want you to think about that in this sense. We sit around and think to ourselves, yes, I can understand the difference between good and evil. I can understand the difference between light and darkness. Look at me. I'm smart. Yet, God says, do you have any idea at all why I, a holy and good God, intentionally formed the devil to be an instrument of evil? Can you, O Job, can you, O Pastor Mark, give a definitive answer to the ancient question of theodicy? You know the ancient question of theodicy. If God is good, then why is there evil in this world? If God is good and holy and righteous, why is he sovereignly decreed that there should be evil in the world? Give me an answer. Can you? I mean, here we're sitting here. I mean, the irony of this is not lost on me. It shouldn't be lost on you either. Here we are sitting in this situation. Job is sitting in this situation. Why? Because of a creature that God himself formed and said to him, go and do your best to Job. Why? That doesn't seem right. Why would God do that? Why would a holy God cause suffering, pain, and difficulty to come, right? That's the theodicy question that's always plagued men for thousands of years. Books have been written on the subject attempting to definitively give an answer to the theodicy question, but they never quite get there. Why? Because none of us were there when God established these things. He has done these things because he desired to do so. That's the point. The sarcasm of verse 21 is to put Job in his place. You weren't here when I made these choices. You weren't around when I created a unique angelic creature and made him more beautiful than all the others. And then I put pride in his heart. And he fell. And I used him. Explain it. Go ahead. Give it a try. All right? See it? Where were you, O Job? How about, now let's go back to, let's go forward, I should say, to verses 31 to 33. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season, or can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? Now, I'm going there because this is chronological, all right? So I'm following the order that we have in Genesis, which would put us now into day 4 of the creation, in which God established the lights in the heavens. It is estimated, I've used this before, I'm going to go there again. As you can see, I'm fairly fascinated by this. It is estimated now by scientists that there are approximately, or at least, as from our observable perspective, at least 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. When I was growing up, they figured that number was probably about 100 and 150. Ha! They were a little wrong. And then they put Hubble up there, and guess what they discovered? And each of these galaxies contains billions of stars, implying that there are, if you do some math here, more than 2 septillion stars in the universe. I love that number, septillion. It's a 1 with 24 zeros behind it. 2 septillion has twice the number of zeros in it than our current national debt. You can't fathom 32 trillion, can you? Therefore, you can't fathom something that's of a magnitude, not a multiplier, a magnitude larger, by having twice as many zeros in it. In fact, if you want to do something, very interesting, go pull up the images to the new James Webb Telescope. You can go online, Google them, and say, just type in James Webb images, and there's a page dedicated to the pictures that have come back from the new James Webb Telescope. They make anything that Hubble looked at. There's a deep field image of from the James Webb Telescope that is beyond your comprehension. It is unbelievable in its scope. And when you look at it, all the little dots are not stars, they're galaxies of stars. So God comes along here and he says, he mentions 4 celestial objects here. First, the Pleiades, which is what we call the Seven Sisters star cluster. It's officially named M45. It's just northwest of Taurus. If you go out on a typical summer's eve, you can see the Pleiades in the sky. It looks like a little smudge of light. You have to look away from it to actually see. If you look directly at it, it disappears. But if you look just a bit to the right or to the left, your peripheral vision can see it. If you have a good set of binoculars, you can see it perfectly. It's a beautiful little thing. The second he refers to is the Orion, verse 31. The Orion is the hunter constellation of the northern celestial hemisphere. The third that I'll mention here is what he mentions in the end of verse 32 is the bear with his children. That is the constellation Ursa Major, otherwise known as the Big Dipper in the sky. And then the fourth that he mentions is the word Mazzaroth in verse 32. Now, the word Mazzaroth here is something known as a hapax legomenon. It is a word only used once in Scripture. Okay, a hapax legomenon is a word that's only used once. And so the problem with that is if it's only used once, how do you figure out what it means? And the only possibility is to look at its context. Okay, so in this case, this word is a word in Hebrew, a general word in Hebrew, meaning a general constellation of the zodiac. Just a general reference to some sort of constellation of some sort. So God mentions the Pleiades, Orion, and the bear specifically, and then turns his attention to sort of general constellations. But that's not what I want you to notice here. Okay, it's not the objects themselves that matter here in this. What matters is this. God uses terms like bind the chains of, or lead forth, or establish their rule. What he's saying is, he's not just referring to their creation, but to their movements. Can you govern their movements? Can you change where they go? Can you change where they're moving? And I think that God is probably in this case referring much more than to the objects themselves than to the forces that bind the universe together. Gravity, for example, is still, for all practical purposes, in the scientific community, an ununderstandable concept. We do not understand where it comes from. And we have some idea that mass produces gravity in some sort of sense, but we don't exactly know how. And we don't know why gravity as a force continues across a massive distance unchanged. We're 93 million miles from the sun, and yet the gravitational attraction of the sun towards us is exactly the same here 93 million miles away as it is to Mercury, which is 10 times closer to the sun than we are. Don't know. The forces that make these things up, gravity, inertia, entropy, all the centripetal and centrifugal forces, the greater and lesser nuclear forces, all these things. What God is saying is, oh Job, dear Job, my friend, can you move the stars around? Can you establish how galaxies are formed and stay together? Can you keep the sun and moon in their places? Okay, let's not even go out to the galaxies. Let's just talk about our nearest neighbor, a little satellite that rotates around the Earth called the moon. Can you control that? Of course, the answer is no. In other words, since your life, oh Job, is so limited spatially, how can you possibly understand the forces at work in the universe? How can you understand your very existence on this tiny blue speck in the midst of all of that? You really begin to fathom the limitations of human beings when you get in an airplane and fly to the other side of the earth. When you take 24 hours to fly by aircraft to the other side of the earth and realize you've only gone a third of the way around this tiny little speck. Imagine trying to go 1,000,000 times further to get to Mars, for example. And that's just to Mars. Do you have any idea of all of this? Have you created any of this? Do you keep all this in play? Now to verse 22. Okay, so now we're moving again chronologically. 22. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? 25. Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, or on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground sprout grass? 34. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Now you see where God goes next. He goes from space to the planet, to the ecosystems of the earth, right? As I mentioned above, the essentials needed for life to exist on dry land. The essentials needed for life to exist on dry land. You remember in the Genesis account, it tells us that God separated the waters from the land, didn't he? And he called the waters the sea, and he called the dry land earth, right? He separated the water from the land. And then he also separated waters below from waters above. So there was waters above and a canopy up above, and then there were waters below, which we call the sea. This separation, by the way, would imply, if he separated it, that the land would then be dry. If you separate one from the other, guess what happens? You have dry land and you have seas full of water. It's a separation, by the way, that requires man to bring water from the sea to irrigate for crops. If God had left the separation the way he originally did it, if he had left the separation between the sea and the land, then it would require man to bring water to the land in order to irrigate for crops. However, 96% of the water on the face of the earth is salinated. It cannot be drunk. It cannot be used to grow crops because it is salinated. You cannot irrigate with seawater. Therefore, God created an ecosystem whereby water from the sea, without its salt, would come through clouds and rain to nourish the dry ground upon which to grow crops. Isn't that interesting? Even producing rivers that would move water to where it was needed. You see that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, when it said that God formed rivers to water the garden. And these systems are very finely tuned to prevent too much water. See, our problem isn't too little water. Our problem is too much. You know how I know that? There's a whole lot of people in Noah's day who discovered that the hard way. The problem isn't too little. The problem is too much. So here comes God, and he says to Job, Job, can you control the weather? Look, we can't even predict the weather, right? Much less control it. Can you, O Job, bring rain upon the earth when it is needed? Can you tune the balance between deluge and drought? You have the ability to control when water comes and when it doesn't come. We lived in Kansas for 11 years, and in Kansas, they don't measure water by the inch. They measure it by the hundredth of an inch. So they come together on Sunday mornings, and the farmers are all standing there looking at each other and go, how much you get last night? Oh, I got 200s. How much did you get? Oh, I got 400s. And this is why I call them after I come here and talk to them a little bit, and I say, yeah, in coastal Alabama, we're measuring it in feet. I mean, we get more rain in 5 minutes than you get in a summer in Kansas. Job, since your entire existence is predicated on the fine balance of nature itself, and you have zero control over how it operates, how can you claim to be knowledgeable enough to understand things even more precisely balanced and controlled? If the weather is finely balanced and controlled, and you have no control over that, as simple as that is, how can you claim to have any control over other more weighty matters that are also finely tuned? So let me consider with you something here. Let me make an observation, if I might step back from this speech, this first half of the first half. Your life and my life are the results of an endless number of decisions and actions stretching back all the way to the beginning of time. Your life and my life, your circumstances, your realities, your existence is based on an innumerable number of decisions and actions that stretch all the way back to the beginning of time. Let me give you an example, just to make sure you understand what I'm saying. If your great-great-great-great-grandmother had rejected the advances of your great-great-great-great-grandfather, you and your parents and your grandparents would not exist. If that woman, 150 years ago or so, had said, no thank you, to your great-grandfather, you would not exist. One decision, so many years ago, made it possible for you to exist. You see? Now multiply that by a few septillion, because that's what we are. We are the results of an endless number of decisions and actions that stretches back through times. And our lives are the culmination of a septillions of choices and actions dating all the way back to the beginning of time. Any slight alteration along the way changes everything going forward. Science fiction lovers love to dive into this idea and consider it, right? Get in a time machine, go back in time, step on a butterfly, come back, and everything's changed. That, by the way, is a real story. Thus, to understand the why of anything that happens to you along the way would require God to explain the entire history of time up to the situation for which you demand an answer. You want to know why? You want to know why you're suffering, dear Job? Let me explain it to you. See where God's going here? He said, look, the only way you're ever going to understand all this is if you can go all the way back to the beginning of time and understand all of this. And this, of course, is unexplainable to our finite minds, right? Just as it's unexplainable as the boundaries of the sea, or it's unexplainable as the separation of light and darkness. It's unexplainable as the forces of order in the universe and the finely tuned ecosystems on this planet that keep us alive. We can't explain any of that. What makes you think we're going to be able to understand all of what it took to get you to where you are and the circumstances that you are now asking why? All of which the sovereign Lord understands and manages. All of which the sovereign Creator knows, ordains, and manages. He knows. As the Alpha and the Omega, God knows all things because he formed all things and he sustains all things along the path, finely tuning each detail to accomplish his final purposes. The human race wants to believe that all of this is one royal accident. It's not. It is a creator who has established everything, put everything in its place, tuned it all perfectly, and ordains every single moment of it going along. We know little, if anything, because we are at the mercy of forces beyond our comprehension and control. And thus, for us to go to God and demand an answer from him is to mistake who we are. It is to say, oh, I can understand it. Go ahead, explain it to me. And God says, really? Can you understand the boundaries of the sea and where it stops and where it starts? No. Can you understand how the stars stay in place and move around as they do? The moon being where it is? And by the way, that moon, God has purposed to always have the same face towards us. Why? I don't know. But he did. Do you understand? Do you get it? Do you have any idea at all of why solar winds blow from the sun over the earth and cause the auroras at the poles? Do you know? Do you have any understanding of that? Do you have any concept, any clue whatsoever? And the answer is no. And that's our problem. Now, it is true that God has revealed much for us to understand. He has given us his word. He has given us natural revelation. He has given us special revelation. Yes, he has opened the floodgates of much information. But this does not imply that we in some way have a right to question the power or the morality, the why of the sovereign God who ordains all that comes to pass. It is foolishness and the height of hubris for us to stand before God and say, tell me why. And God's response is, if I told you why, you would be destroyed. Because I am God, and you are not. So in the end, we stand powerless before an almighty God. We must trust him to govern all things according to his eternal counsels and purposes, and walk by faith, knowing he is God. It's not our place to ask why. It's our place to be humble before him and walk by faith in his sight, and to say to him, I trust you, the sovereign creator, to do all things good according to the counsel of your purposes. I may not personally like what you've decided, but it's hubris for us to ask why. What God does in this part of the speech, and it carries on, we're not done with this. God simply says, can you handle this? Boom! And the answer is no. But God has given to us faith. He has poured out into us the ability to trust him. The rest of the world wants to go on its way seeking the answers to everything, searching desperately in the darkness for an answer. But when we who know this Christ have been given faith by the Spirit of God, we come before him humbly, submissive. You, O God, are God. I am not. You don't answer to me. I answer to you. For you are the sovereign God, who has loved me with an everlasting love. So here we are.